The dining hall always felt like a different world to her. Bright chandeliers, polished floors, soft music humming in the background, and people dressed in clothes that cost more than her monthly rent. Yet she moved through it quietly, almost unnoticed, carrying trays with steady hands and a calm expression. She didn't mind being invisible. In fact, she preferred it. Her name was Lena, and she had been working at the private dining club for almost a year. Every shift felt the same. Smile politely, bring out dishes, refill water glasses, listen to customers talk about holidays, cars, investments, and all the things she couldn't even imagine affording. At first, she thought she would feel out of place here, but over time she learned how to blend into the background. When people didn't expect anything from you, they didn't bother you. Still, every time she passed the grand piano sitting in the center of the hall, something inside her tightened. It was a beautiful instrument shining black, always perfectly tuned, always catching the light of the chandelier above it. But no one touched it unless a hired musician came in. The piano reminded her of everything she left behind and everything she tried to forget. She would glance at it sometimes, then quickly look away, forcing her feet to keep moving. Her life now was simple: work, home, sleep, repeat. And that was okay. She didn't need more. Wanting more felt dangerous. But on this particular evening, the club was hosting a private dinner for several wealthy families, and the atmosphere was busier than usual. People chatted loudly. The kitchen was running at full speed, and the manager was pacing near the bar, his forehead wrinkled with stress. Lena placed a basket of warm bread on a table and noticed the tension spreading among the staff. They whispered to each other, each passing the same message along. The pianist canceled. No show. The guests are already complaining. A few diners had already noticed the silence in the room. Without music, the hall felt wrong, too sharp, too exposed. The soft melodies normally played by the evening musician helped keep guests relaxed and entertained. Tonight, without it, frustration was building. People had paid for an experience, not just food. Lena didn't pay much attention at first. Problems like this weren't hers to solve. She picked up empty plates, delivered new orders, and kept her pace steady. But the murmurs grew louder. One man sitting at a long table near the center complained loudly to the manager. He wasn't shouting, but his voice carried enough authority that everyone nearby heard him. He wore an expensive suit and a watch that glimmered brighter than the silverware on the table. The others at his table seemed used to his attitude. They laughed politely at his remarks even when they weren't funny. "Unbelievable," he said, gesturing around. "This place charges premium prices, and we don't even get music tonight?" Manager apologized repeatedly, explaining that the hired player had a personal emergency. The man scoffed. "Emergency? Hire someone else. Surely you have someone here who can play something, anything, even a simple tune." Families at other tables nodded along, whispering among themselves, annoyed that their evening wasn't going perfectly. Lena heard it all while refilling glasses. She kept her eyes down, focusing on her work. She hoped no one would drag her into the conversation. She simply wanted the night to pass peacefully. But then one of the guests pointed at her. "What about her?" the wealthy man said with a mocking tone. "Maybe the waitress knows Twinkle, Twinkle or something basic. That would be better than this silence." A few people laughed, not cruelly, but because they assumed he wasn't serious. They thought it was just a joke meant to lighten the situation. But jokes like that still carried weight. They still stung. Lena froze for a second, feeling heat rush into her chest. She wasn't embarrassed, she was startled. She didn't expect to be singled out. She never wanted to be the center of attention. She gave a small, polite smile, the kind she used whenever she didn't want trouble, and continued to pour water. She hoped the conversation would move on, but the man didn't stop. "She looks like she might know something." He continued, eyeing her like she was part of the entertainment. "Come on, miss. Surely you've tapped a few keys before. Play us something simple. We're all waiting." His table laughed again. Other guests looked at her with curiosity, some even encouragingly, as if the idea was harmless fun. But to her, it wasn't harmless. It was exactly the kind of attention she had spent so long avoiding. The manager rushed over, trying to calm the situation. "Sir, our staff is here to serve food and assist you." They're not hired musicians. Oh, relax, the man said, waving his hand dismissively. It's just a piano. Anyone can play a basic tune. Lena kept her head down and stepped away from the table, her heartbeat quickening. She moved toward the kitchen corridor, but before she could disappear, one of her coworkers stopped her. You okay? The coworker asked, noticing the tension in Lena's face. Yeah, Lena whispered. Though she wasn't sure if it was true. Don't take it personally, the coworker said kindly. Some guests don't know how they sound. Just keep doing your job, he'll get bored soon. Lena nodded and forced a small smile, but her mind wasn't calm. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, an old familiar ache. The mention of the piano, the attention, the expectation. She had worked so hard to bury those parts of her life. She went back to the floor, keeping her movements careful and quiet. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. She hoped the idea would fade, but the wealthy man wasn't done embarrassing her for his amusement. When she passed his table again, he raised his voice just enough for others to hear. Still no music? Really? He sighed dramatically, then looked straight at her. Are you sure you don't know anything? Just a simple melody? That's all I'm asking? You'd actually be helping the entire room. Lena felt several eyes turn toward her. Some seemed sympathetic, others entertained. The pressure of being watched made her palms sweat. She shook her head politely. I'm sorry, sir. I'm just here to serve tonight. He leaned back in his chair and smirked. Figures. That one word figures felt heavier than it should. It wasn't insulting on the surface. The tone carried a message. Someone like you wouldn't know anything useful anyway. Her chest tightened, but she didn't react. She had dealt with worse comments before. She simply kept moving. The night continued with rising tension. Guests whispered to each other about the lack of music, some complaining, others making suggestions. The staff tried to keep service smooth, but the atmosphere was off balance. Even the soft clinking of dishes felt louder without music, masking the sounds through all of it. The grand piano sat untouched, silent, waiting, glowing softly under the chandelier as if reminding her it still existed. Every time Lena passed it, she felt the weight of the evening pressing down on her. She didn't like attention, and she didn't want conflict. She especially didn't want anyone expecting her to play. She had promised herself long ago that no matter what happened, she would keep her life simple and quiet. No performances. No pressure, no stage. Not ever again. She tried to distract herself with work. She focused on the details, making sure the napkins were folded neatly, the glasses placed evenly, the dishes delivered on time. She reminded herself that she was good at this job. It was steady and predictable. That was all she needed. But fate has a strange way of nudging people toward the very things they're trying to avoid. Near the end of her shift, she returned to the main hall carrying a tray of desserts. As she approached a table, she overheard a couple whispering. Such a shame, the woman said. We were looking forward to the music. I know, her partner replied. It always completes the evening. Without it, the room feels empty. The word empty hit something deep inside Lena. She couldn't help but look at the piano again. It seemed almost alive under the warm lights, as if waiting for someone to wake it up. And for a fleeting second, she imagined sitting at it again, her fingers on the keys. The sound filling the room, the feeling of losing herself in music like she used to. But the thought terrified her just as quickly as it came. She shook it away and focused on placing the desserts carefully in front of the guests. She forced her mind back into the present. Just as she stepped away, her coworker approached her again. This time their voice was softer, more serious. Why did you freeze earlier when he mentioned the piano? The coworker asked. Do you actually know how to play? What? Lena's breath caught for a moment. She tried to remain calm. It's nothing. Just an old part of my life. The coworker tilted their head. Old or not, you reacted like it meant something. She didn't want to talk about it. Talking made memories rise, and memories made her chest ache. She had worked too hard to leave that life behind. Reality was quieter, safer. It's nothing, she repeated gently. I'm fine. Her coworker nodded slowly, clearly sensing she didn't want to continue the conversation. They gave her a small smile and returned to their tasks. But the question lingered in her head. Do you actually know how to play? Of course she knew. She knew more than just how to play. She had lived and breathed music for years. She had devoted her entire childhood to it, her entire heart. The piano had once been her world, but life had a way of twisting dreams until they no longer felt like dreams at all. Some losses were too painful to reopen, even in memory. That was why she never told anyone at the restaurant. She never wanted music to be part of her life again. But tonight, the piano sat there like a quiet reminder. Her secret wasn't gone. It was only sleeping. She looked around the hall. Guests were growing progressively more restless. Staff members were stressed. The manager kept apologizing. The wealthy man who mocked her earlier kept checking his watch, shaking his head dramatically so everyone could see how inconvenienced he was. Lena wanted the night to end, but deep down, a tiny part of her felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not sadness. Something like a pull. She shook her head again, trying to stop the feeling before it grew into something she couldn't control. She wasn't ready for that. She didn't want that attention. She didn't want to step back into a world she had left behind. She had good reasons. Still, as the minutes passed, she noticed guests glancing toward the piano more and more. She felt her heartbeat change slow. Heavy, uneven. Her past, the one she tried to bury, was standing only a few feet away, waiting quietly under a chandelier, and she didn't know how much longer she could avoid it. The tension in the room slowly grew heavier as the evening went on. Conversations turned shorter, smiles faded, and the uncomfortable silence without music settled over the tables like a thick blanket. People still ate, but their attention kept drifting toward the grand piano in the center of the hall, almost as if they were waiting for it to magically start playing on its own. Lena tried to stay focused on her work. She moved between tables, serving dishes, clearing plates, and doing her best to ignore the stares she felt on her back. Most seemed harmless, just curious glances from guests who had noticed the small exchange earlier, but a few looks carried something else, a kind of amused expectation. Like they were waiting for her to be called again. She hoped the wealthy man who singled her out earlier had moved on from his idea. She didn't want another moment of being the center of attention, but deep down, she knew people like him rarely let go of something once they found it entertaining, and she was right. As she walked past his table again, he leaned back in his chair and gave her a look that felt like he was inspecting something on display. "There she is," he said loudly enough for several tables to hear. "Still avoiding the piano, I see." A few guests chuckled. Others pretended not to notice. Lena kept her face calm, even though she felt that familiar tightness in her chest again. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to embarrass the staff. So she simply replied with a polite tone. "I'm just doing my job, sir." He smirked. "Oh, come on. Don't be shy. This room needs a bit of life. You could help all of us out with one tiny tune. A simple melody, that's all." She shook her head softly and continued walking. She didn't owe him or anyone a performance. She didn't know anyone her past, but he wasn't ready to let her go. "Hey," he called out again. "You can't play even a little?" His voice wasn't rude, but it was mocking. It was the tone of someone who didn't expect an answer. The tone of someone who had already decided she wasn't capable. The people at nearby tables turned their heads. Some seemed annoyed at him for dragging the evening out like this. Others seemed entertained, as if this whole situation was a casual distraction from their fancy meals. Lena paused and slowly turned back toward him, keeping her expression neutral. "I can't play tonight, sir," she said gently. "I'm part of the service staff. I'm not scheduled or allowed to perform." It wasn't the complete truth, but it was the easiest explanation. He raised his eyebrows as if that made things worse. "Not allowed?" He repeated, "What a strange rule. Seems silly to let a perfectly good piano sit there while the whole room suffers through silence." He wasn't exactly wrong. The room did feel strange without music, but she still didn't want to be part of his game. He glanced at the manager, who stood nearby trying to smooth things over. "Why don't you just let her try?" he said. "What harm could it do?" The manager looked like he was caught between a wall and a harder wall. He wanted to keep the guests happy, but he also knew forcing an employee to perform anything was a terrible idea. He gave a friendly but firm smile. "Sir, our staff has assigned roles," the manager said carefully. "We don't ask them to perform unless they're trained for it." "But that's what I'm asking," the man insisted. "Let her." He looked at Lena again, his eyes sharp with curiosity and amusement. "Or is there another reason she's refusing? Maybe she doesn't know how to play at all." Something about that comment felt like a jab meant to poke at her pride. He wanted a reaction, any reaction. He wanted to entertain himself with her discomfort. She felt heat in her cheeks, but kept her expression steady. "I'm just here to serve tonight," she repeated, her voice steady but soft. The man sighed dramatically and leaned back in his chair, making sure the whole room saw how disappointed he was. "Well, that's unfortunate," he said loudly. "It would have been nice to discover some hidden talent among the staff, but I suppose we can't expect too much." The last sentence carried a tone she recognized too well in. Assumption that someone like her couldn't possibly have any hidden abilities worth noticing? A few people at his table chuckled uncomfortably, the sort of laugh people give when they know something isn't kind, but they don't want to confront the person saying it. Lena forced herself to walk away slowly and calmly. Even though she felt her heart beating harder with every step, she placed empty dishes on her tray.
Ouch!
And started toward the kitchen. But her coworker gently grabbed her arm and pulled her to the side where the guests couldn't hear. "You all right?" the coworker asked. Lena nodded automatically. "Yes, I'm used to this kind of thing." The coworker frowned. "You shouldn't have to be." Lena didn't answer. What could she say? She had learned long ago that staying silent kept life easier. People forgot you faster when you didn't speak too much, you know? The coworker said softly. "You don't have to let him talk to you like that." "I know," Lena replied. "But arguing won't make things better," her coworker sighed. "I just wish he'd stop bothering you." Everyone wished that. Even other tables seemed tired of his theatrics. But someone like him didn't stop unless something else grabbed his attention. The trouble was, nothing else was grabbing anyone's attention tonight. The silence made every little moment louder, every gap more noticeable, and the grand piano wasn't helping. It looked almost too perfect, sitting there untouched and gleaming softly under the chandelier. It was placed in the center of the room for a reason. Normally it was part of the charm, part of the luxury experience. But tonight, it felt like the center of everyone's frustration. The longer Lena worked around it, the harder it became to ignore. Every step she took near it stirred old memories she wasn't ready to face. She remembered performances, applause, lessons, long hours of practice, and dreams that once felt bright enough to blind her. She remembered the moment everything fell apart too, but she tried not to think about that. Life had changed. She had changed. Still, she couldn't deny the way her fingers twitched every time she passed the piano. As if they remembered something her heart didn't want to feel anymore. She carried a tray back to the kitchen, set it down, and took a deep breath. She needed a moment to collect her thoughts. The evening wasn't even over yet, but before she could step back out, the manager entered the kitchen with a stressed expression. "Lena," he said gently, her stomach flipped. She knew what was coming even before he spoke again. "I need to ask you something," he continued. Not as an order. Just a question. She didn't say anything. She waited. "The guests are very impatient tonight," he said. "And the man at table 12 is difficult." She almost smiled at the understatement. He sighed. "Do you know how to play even something small? A simple tune? I only ask because it might calm the room down. But I won't force you. I promise." Lena froze. Her hands grew cold, even though her palms were sweating. She looked down at the floor. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because he keeps pointing at you," the manager replied honestly. "And because the idea is already in everyone's head. They don't expect a perfect performance, just something to fill the silence." Her heart ached at the thought. Everyone watching her. Everyone judging. Everyone assuming she was either a joke or someone to impress them. She shook her head slowly. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm sorry." The manager nodded respectfully. That's completely fine. I won't ask again. He gave her a comforting smile and walked away. But as soon as he left, she felt an unexpected wave of guilt. She knew he wasn't trying to pressure her. He was just trying to keep the evening from falling apart. And she knew the rest of the staff was struggling too. They kept getting complaints, and none of them could do anything about it. Still, she couldn't force herself to walk over to that piano. Not yet, not with all those eyes watching. When she returned to the dining hall, the atmosphere felt even heavier. Plates were nearly empty, conversations were dull and half-hearted, and guests kept glancing toward the piano with impatience. Table 12, especially, seemed restless. The wealthy man tapped his fingers on the table like a drum, looking around as if he expected entertainment to simply appear. When he spotted Lena again, he grinned in a way that made her stomach twist. There she is, he said loudly. The shy musician who refuses to play. Lena didn't react. One of the women at his table, someone elegant and polite-looking, leaned in and whispered, "Maybe you should leave her alone. She seems uncomfortable." But the man shrugged. "I'm only trying to lighten the mood. What's wrong with a little request?" Nothing was wrong with a request. What was wrong was the way he said it, like he was amused by the idea of watching her struggle. When she passed close to the piano again, she slowed down for just a second. Not because she wanted to, but because she felt the pressure building. And her mind was getting crowded with old memories she had kept locked away for so long. She remembered sitting at a piano much like this one in her childhood home, until her fingers ached but smiling anyway because she loved it. She remembered the thrill of performing, the way her heart beat with excitement instead of fear. She remembered the pride in her father's eyes when she mastered a difficult piece. But she also remembered the night. Everything changed. The night she stopped playing altogether. The night she decided she wasn't good enough for the world she once belonged to. As she stood there for a brief moment, lost in thought, she didn't notice someone approaching from behind until she heard a soft voice. "Do you want to?" her coworker asked. Lena turned slightly. "Want to what?" "Play," the coworker said gently. "I saw how you looked at the piano." Lena looked away. "It doesn't matter. It matters if it's hurting you." Lena's throat tightened. "It's just an instrument," she whispered. But she knew it wasn't. The piano wasn't just an instrument to her. It was a part of herself she had abandoned because life had forced her to. Her coworker sighed softly. "Look, no one will think less of you for saying no. But also, you don't have to hide from things that once made you happy." Happiness. That felt like a distant memory. Before she could answer, a loud voice echoed again. "Excuse me, can we get someone to play something already?" The wealthy man said loudly, almost shouting across the hall now. Several guests murmured, in agreement, not because they were trying to be rude, but because the tension in the room had grown unbearable. Everyone looked around. Everyone looked at the piano, and then, as if guided by some invisible force, everyone's eyes slowly drifted toward her. She felt a wave of heat rush through her body. Her heart pounded so hard she feared others could hear it. She felt exposed, trapped between her past and her present. She swallowed hard. Her coworker gave her one last look, a look that wasn't pushy, but supportive. "You don't have to," they whispered. "But if you do, we'll have your back." Lena took a shaky breath, and for the first time all night, instead of walking away from the piano, she took one small step toward it. It was a tiny step, barely noticeable, but it was enough to change the entire room, enough to silence the whispers, enough to make every eye follow her. Her heart raced faster as she approached the shining black piano, feeling more exposed with every inch. She wasn't sure what she was doing. She wasn't sure she could handle what came next. All she knew was that something deep inside her had awakened something she had tried to bury for years. And now it refused to stay quiet. Lena didn't plan to walk toward the piano. Her body moved before her mind agreed. It felt as if something inside her had finally broken free after years of being locked away. Every step made her heart beat harder, but she couldn't turn back now, with the whole room watching. She tried not to look at anyone. She kept her eyes down, focused on the glossy floor beneath her shoes. The dining hall seemed to stretch longer than ever, like a long tunnel she had to cross. Each footstep sounded louder than it should, though the room was silent enough to hear even a breath. Tables that she walked past earlier without thinking now felt like obstacles. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes, some full of curiosity, others of impatience, and a few filled with something different, something almost hopeful. That surprised her the most. Not everyone doubted her, she realized. A few guests actually wanted her to succeed, not because they expected greatness, but because they sensed something fragile in her, something worth protecting. Still, she could sense the pressure from the wealthy man at table 12. He leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk as if he had won something. So if this entire moment was his idea, and she was simply performing his entertainment. The thought frustrated her, not enough to make her angry, but enough to make her straighten her back slightly. If she was going to take even one step toward the piano, it would not be for him. She wasn't playing to please him. She wasn't playing because the room demanded music. She wasn't even sure she was playing at all. She just needed to stop running. When she finally reached the piano, she stopped and stared at it, as if seeing it for the first time. The polished black surface reflected her face, faintly distorted by the shine. It looked more like a mirror than an instrument. Her reflection looked nervous, almost fragile, but there was a small spark in her eyes that she hadn't seen in years. She touched the edge of the piano lightly with her fingertips. It was cool and smooth, like the surface of a still lake before dawn. Her breathing slowed as she ran her fingers along the side, feeling the familiar shape. Even after so many years of avoiding it, her hands remembered. They always remembered. A soft whisper reached her from behind. "You don't have to play," her coworker said quietly. "You can walk away now, and no one will think less of you." Lena nodded. She appreciated the support more than words could express. But walking away wasn't an option anymore. She wasn't sure she would forgive herself if she left. This moment, unfinished. She pulled the small bench out carefully and sat down. The room exhaled all at once, like everyone had been holding their breath until she was seated. Lena felt the shift. It made her nervous, but also strangely motivated. She took a deep breath and let her hands rest on her lap. Her fingers trembled slightly. It wasn't fear alone, it was the ache of memory. The feeling of coming home to something she once loved, but abandoned. Her mind raced with doubts. What if she messed up? What if she froze? What if they laughed? She shook her head gently. She couldn't think like that. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. Not pressing yet, just feeling the smooth ivory under her fingertips. The coolness sent a shiver up her arms. It was a sensation she had missed without realizing it. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She remembered being a child, her feet too small to reach the pedals. Her father placing his hand over hers to teach her how to feel the rhythm instead of forcing it. She remembered late nights practicing until she fell asleep at the keys. She remembered performing in small halls, her heart full of hope. She remembered the last performance she ever gave, the one that ended everything, the mistakes she made. The harsh judgment, the disappointment she saw on stage lights and in the faces watching her. She had let that moment define her for years. Maybe it was time to stop letting that one. Night controlled her whole life. She opened her eyes slowly. The wealthy man lifted his glass, clearly expecting a joke or a simple melody. Other guests leaned forward, ready for anything, whether it was impressive or terrible. But before she played a single note, something unexpected happened. The room grew quiet, not because people were waiting, but because they sensed something different. Something serious, something real. Lena inhaled deeply and pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost like a whisper, but pure and warm. It spread through the room slowly, like a gentle breeze. She pressed another key, then another. The melody began hesitant, fragile, almost shy. It wasn't a song she planned. It wasn't a song she practiced. It was something she created in the moment, something her heart whispered to her hands. The guests leaned in closer. Not out of expectation, but out of surprise. They didn't expect something like this, a melody that felt like a quiet secret slowly unfolding. Lena's hands started to relax. The tension in her shoulders eased. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, remembering patterns and shapes they once mastered. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply speaking through the keys in a way she couldn't speak through words. The melody deepened, flowing into something richer. It carried hints of sadness, hope, and something gentle, almost like forgiveness. It wasn't perfect. Some notes landed heavier than others. Few came a little late. But those imperfections made it more human, more heartfelt. The wealthy man's smirk slowly faded. He leaned forward, confused at first, as if he expected a clumsy tune and wasn't prepared for something real. His expression softened, and for the first time that evening he seemed unsure of himself. The elegant woman beside him smiled softly, touched by the music. She nudged him subtly as if to say, "See? She's not what you thought." Lena didn't see any of this. Her eyes stayed closed now. Her fingers moved on their own. They slid across the keys gracefully, gaining confidence with each passing moment. The melody grew fuller, rising and falling like a story being told without a single word spoken. She didn't feel the room watching anymore. She didn't feel the pressure or the eyes or the silence. She didn't even feel her own fear. All she felt was the music, and it felt like breathing. Again, after years underwater, then something inside her unlocked a deeper part, something she kept buried under fear and doubt. Her hands shifted into a new pattern, one she had not played since she was young. It was the beginning of the piece she once composed, but never finished. A piece she refused to play again after her last performance. When the first notes of that piece sounded, a weak breath escaped her lips, half painful, half freeing. She let herself keep going. The room fell into an even deeper silence. No forks clinked. No glasses moved. No whispers slipped through the air. Everyone was completely still. The melody rose gently at first, then swelled with emotion, filling the hall with something warm and fragile. It wrapped around the listeners like a soft blanket, pulling them into her world. Even the staff paused. Servers holding trays stood still in the doorway. The manager stopped mid-step. Her coworker watched with wide eyes, their hands pressed to their chest as if the music had reached inside them too. The wealthy man at table 12 lowered his head, surprised and humbled. It was clear he had misjudged her not just a little. But completely. Lena kept playing, letting her emotions spill through her fingers. It felt like releasing years' worth of feelings she didn't dare speak aloud. She poured every moment of pain, hope, fear, and longing into the keys. Her heart felt heavy and light at the same time. Like a storm breaking into sunshine, the melody reached a soft, trembling high point. Her fingers slowed. The notes stretched longer, more delicate. She held each sound for a heartbeat, letting it settle in the air before moving on. Then she descended into a quieter, tender sequence, like a whisper of peace. The ending came naturally. She didn't force it. She didn't rush it. She simply let the music fade gently, like a candle burning low until it flickered out. When the final note rang through the room, it lingered in the air long after her hands left the keys. Her eyes opened. She didn't look at the crowd right away. She stared at her hands, surprised by her own courage. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Not because they were unsure, but because no one wanted to break the magic that hung in the air. Finally, a single clap echoed from somewhere at the back, then another, then more, and suddenly the entire room burst into applause. Loud, warm, genuine applause that filled the hall with energy. Lena blinked, stunned. She had expected doubt, judgment, maybe even laughter. But she didn't expect this. She didn't expect to feel accepted. Guests stood up. Some clapped with bright smiles. Some looked emotional. The elegant woman at table 12 clapped the loudest, tears glistening in her eyes. The wealthy man clapped too slowly, awkwardly but sincerely. His face was flushed with humility, his earlier arrogance replaced with something softer. Lena didn't know what to do. She gave a small, shy nod and stood from the bench. Her legs felt shaky, but she managed a tiny smile. Her coworker rushed to her side with wide, teary eyes. "That was incredible," they whispered. You were amazing." Lena didn't trust her voice, so she just nodded again. The manager approached next, speechless at first. Then he said quietly, "Thank you. Truly, that was unforgettable." She felt overwhelmed, but somehow lighter than she had felt in years, as she stepped away from the piano. The applause continued behind her. For the first time since she stopped playing, she felt a small piece of her old self returning. Not the part that feared failure, not the part that quit, but the part that loved music simply because it made her feel alive. Tonight, she hadn't played for the guests. She hadn't played for the wealthy man. She hadn't even played for her. Past, she played for herself, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. The moment Lena's fingers touched the keys, the world inside the dining hall changed. It didn't happen suddenly. It was slow, almost gentle, like a curtain lifting. At first, she barely pressed the keys, letting out a soft sound that floated in the air. It wasn't loud enough to impress anyone yet, but it was enough to silence every remaining whisper in the room. People leaned in, curious but doubtful. They still expected nothing more than a simple tune. Maybe something they would forget in a minute. But Lena wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. The lights from the chandelier above made the polished keys glow softly, and the scent of the wooden piano reminded her of the old studio where she once practiced for hours. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time that evening, and she breathed out a long, shaky breath. Then she played the next notes, stronger, deeper. Filled with emotion she had kept hidden for years. The sound grew fuller. The melody opened like a door being pushed wide, and it rolled across the room in smooth waves. People who had been checking their watches suddenly forgot about time. A man who had been halfway through raising his fork stopped, holding it in the air without noticing. A woman near the front crossed her hands on her lap, her expression softening, as if she had just remembered a moment from her own past. Lena let herself get lost in the music. The beginning of the piece was slow, each note like a whisper. But as she moved into the middle, the music started to build. Her fingers moved faster, chasing memories she had kept buried. Every stroke carried a piece of her struggles, her quiet strength, her unspoken dreams. The room, once full of chatter and clinking glasses, felt like a different place now. The wealthy guests who normally liked to show off and speak loudly to be noticed suddenly seemed small, humbled by the sound reaching their ears. Some leaned forward with their elbows on the table, trying to understand how the quiet waitress could create something so powerful. Even the staff paused. A server carrying a tray stood completely still in the corner, afraid to move in case a single step broke the spell. Another worker watched with wide eyes, knowing that this version of Lena, the one sitting at the piano, was someone none of them had ever seen before. The melody suddenly dipped into a soft, delicate section. Lena's fingers moved gently, brushing across the keys like wind moving through trees. She closed her eyes, letting the music guide her. It didn't feel like she was performing for a room of wealthy people. It felt like she was playing for her younger self, the girl who used to dream of stages and crowds back when life felt simpler. People who had judged her earlier now watched her with complete respect. A man in a dark suit glanced at the person beside him and whispered something. But even his whisper seemed too loud in that moment. Another guest wiped the corner of her eye, for pretending she wasn't emotional. Then came the part of the piece that Lena always feared. It was difficult, fast, complicated, and filled with sharp movements. Her teacher once told her it was the kind of section that showed a person's true skill. If you hesitated even a little, the whole piece fell apart. But Lena didn't hesitate. She moved into it with confidence she didn't even know she still had. Her hands glided across the keys with a speed that made people gasp quietly. The notes jumped, fell, rose again, and clashed together in a beautiful storm of sound. It was the kind of moment that made a listener's heart race without knowing why. A few faces in the audience widened with surprise. Some had seen world-class pianists play, but they did not expect a waitress, someone they didn't notice an hour ago, to perform at this level. One man even set down his drink as if afraid to miss a second. Lena didn't notice any of them. She was lost in the music's highest point, letting it pour out of her the way sunlight pours through a half-open window. She didn't think about her job or her worries or the doubts that kept her quiet for years. The only thing that mattered was the piano's voice and the feeling running through her chest. Then, slowly, the storm of notes softened. Lena breathed out as the melody calmed, and the room seemed to exhale with her. The intensity faded into a warm, gentle sound that wrapped around everyone like a soft blanket. The crowd's shoulders relaxed. Some smiled without realizing it. A few people who had been sitting stiffly leaned back as if the music had lifted a heavy weight from their thoughts. In the middle of the room, a young woman clasped her hands together tightly, her eyes slightly shiny. Beside her, an older man nodded to himself, appreciating the control and emotion behind every movement of Lena's hands. Then quietly, the music began to rise again, not loudly, not forcefully. It rose with calm strength, the way morning light creeps across a window. Lena's fingers moved with purpose, guiding the melody into a final, heartfelt message, a message she never spoke in words, a message, of pain, of dreams, paused but not forgotten. People felt it. Every single person in that room felt it. When the final part came, Lena's eyes opened again. She didn't smile. She didn't look at the crowd. She simply allowed the last notes to fall gently. Like drops of rain touching the surface of a quiet lake, the sound lingered in the air for a moment that seemed to last forever. Then she pressed the final key. Silence filled the room. Pure, complete silence. No one moved. No one spoke. For a second, everyone just sat there, letting the emotional weight of the performance sink in. One guest finally blinked, realizing his heart was racing. Another breathed out slowly as if she had been holding her breath the entire time. A soft gasp came from somewhere near the back, followed by a hand covering a mouth in disbelief. The quiet was not awkward, it was respect. Was it as the sound of people realizing they had just witnessed something rare, something. True. Lena slowly lifted her hands from the keys. She didn't know what to expect. Applause? Laughter? Silence forever. She felt unsure, like someone waking up from a deep dream. She kept her eyes low, afraid to meet the faces that had judged her earlier. But the faces had changed. Every expression in the room carried something softer now, something she didn't see often in places filled with power and wealth. These people looked almost humbled, as if her performance had reminded them that talent, beauty, and heart can come from anyone, anywhere, and they still hadn't clapped. They were waiting for the feeling of the moment to finish settling. Finally, somewhere near the front, someone stood up, slowly, then someone else, and then someone in the back. One by one, they rose, not out of habit or politeness, but because sitting felt wrong after hearing something so powerful, and then the applause began. It started gently, hands coming together in soft, respectful claps. Then it grew louder, spreading across the room like a wave. Tables shook slightly as people stood and clapped with real emotion. Some even cheered, unable to hold back the joy they felt. Lena sat frozen, unsure of what to do. She had never received a reaction like this before. She wasn't used to praise, at least not in a room full of wealthy strangers. But when she finally looked up, just for a second, she saw something that made her breath catch. The same people who barely noticed her earlier were now applauding her as if she had changed their whole evening. And she had. Not because she wanted attention. Not because she wanted to prove anything, but because, for the first time in years, she let her true self speak.
Through music, through honesty, through the piano that had been waiting for her all night, and the room,
filled with people who thought they had seen everything, stood in complete admiration of the quiet waitress who played like a star.